Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Super-Fanta-Fi. This being a show where we talk about TV shows of the supernatural, fantasy, and or science fictional genre. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of the Winchesters. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. So this ends up being a very potent episode, not only for John, but also Carlos. It actually ended up being an episode where a lot of people kind of dealt with, like, the past. And obviously some people have taken more, jumping ahead a little bit, it's actually kind of heartbreaking seeing how much everyone else kind of took a step forward with finding their footing, moving past the past, working on it. It's not like a cure-all be-all, but they're all finding their way forward, except for John. And I guess in some ways it feels befitting considering I don't know. I don't know how much of what John is dealing with now, like how much of that is still carried over into, I think that rage, that anger inside of him, you kind of see where it kind of started at. But even his mom says, he's always been a fighter ever since he was a kid. That anytime there's like a fight in front of him, he's going to run straight ahead. So that's something that's probably ingrained in John since he was little. Maybe it has to deal with, a combination of what happened, his dad being out of his life and his dad dying and him never really having that opportunity. And I think once again, just kind of sad how history repeats itself because he kind of was there, but kind of wasn't there for his kids. And so knowing a lot of that anger I think a lot of that was already there. Then you add in the trauma and just the PTSD from, and everything he's carrying from his time in Vietnam. And just, like I said, I think it just stacks upon itself, and he probably eventually finds a way to kind of deal with it. But I think it's still an underlining thing to why he was the dad that he was, and that when he lost Mary, who didn't, obviously people handle loss in different ways, and I think we see how John carried loss, and you can infer and kind of be like, okay, it makes even more sense, like why he, turned out the way he did after Mary did, like why he turned into the father he turned into when Mary died. So I don't know, it's just a lot of interesting things on that front, but this involves VIDS dying, and the moment that happened, I knew it was going to involve John, but we also find out that Carlos is a vet too, and because even John's like, he's like, I don't like go around talking about it, it's just like, because Carlos doesn't present himself like someone because he was a part of the Navy, he doesn't present himself like that, but I think for Carlos, that's kind of like, probably also why, it's just kind of like, I did my time, but he's also like, he didn't willingly sign up for the service like John did or other people did. It turns out he's always been very free-spirited. He loved being able to kind of just do his own thing. He got into some legal trouble, is either go to jail or go into the service, and so he went into the service. And I thought that was a powerful thing that Carlos was willing to open up, and even he had that perspective of not opening up. I think this episode is beautiful in that regard. Of it is not just from that particular time, it is still something that I think, it's a conversation about vets in general, like then even versus now, that, and the sad thing, you can still see those parallels that, this country's gotten, a lot of flack for the fact is that, it doesn't always do the best job when it comes to supporting and helping its vets. And that being such a hard thing to really like talk about, because, for what, especially at this point in time, it is that thing of suck it up. Yes, it still exists even modern day, but like the conversation about mental health is a lot more open than it was in the 70s, but I still think some of those conversations can still be had. I say that as someone who also has an issue opening up. I'm like, I'm like talking about how you feel. It's like, sometimes I can be, but I never get real with it. I still bury a lot, and that's why I feel the commonality with John. Obviously, like his situation is birthed from losing his friend. I'm sure there's a lot, but specifically the Murph stuff does trigger him the most. But who knows what else could? It could be the bigger part of like other small things compounding with the Murph thing. But it seems like that's kind of his main trauma. Once again, he does have the literal scar from when, Murph blew up and part of his metal cross went into his arm. So, but it is his situation and him trying to figure out like, okay, so what's happening, because they're making it seem like these are suicide, which I'm like, when you look at those wounds, how the fuck are you saying those are suicides? That doesn't make any sense. Because then later on, because it turns out the guy that Mary went to see that movie with, was it last episode or whatever? It turns out he's actually a reporter. That's why he's actually in town, is because this is happening all over the place. This is happening to a lot of facilities catered to veterans. And so, like I said, Carlos is a lot more willing and open to talk about his situation. John isn't. And so I think John found some camaraderie with the guy Jimmy, because it's like, yeah, Jimmy's talking about, yeah, I don't want to, because John, he talks about it a little bit about what he went through, but then it's, you could tell he's getting angrier and more anxious in this place, especially when he like busted that, I think it was that paper towel dispenser in the bathroom, he busted it up. And his hands were shaking, and the only way he could stop himself was just releasing that anger. So once again, it really lends itself to the road John goes down later in his life, that anger is there, So, but it turns out the monster behind this is actually a god, which I'm like, oh, that's interesting, because I'm like, the Winchesters later on ran into gods from time to time. It's not like that. Obviously, it wasn't the most common thing but yeah, they've crossed paths with gods, or even angels pretending to be gods at some point. With the whole Gabriel pretending to be he was pretending to be a trickster at first, but then he was kicking it with the gods, and he I don't know if there ever really was I don't think there actually was ever a Loki. It was just Gabriel, angel Gabriel, pretending to kick it with the gods, being like, oh, I'm Loki. So I think that's all that is. Either way, tangents and all that side, it is something that they've crossed paths with gods before. So it's interesting to know, they've had their run. John and Mary and them had their run-ins with their own god, but he's kind of like a god of war. And I thought initially, I was like, okay, so it's his thing, making people relive their trauma, because I figured it had to be about battle, because that's kind of what that's what this kind of seems to be about. He's the Roman god of war, because it's what he's named. Was it Mars NATO? It's it's Neto is kind of its name. So later on, he got Carlos and pulled Carlos into a kind of a hallucination, which Carlos really opened up about something I thought was powerful, when he talked about he saw these lights in the distance, these dots, and I was like, oh, what is that? And he was like, oh yeah, it was their cigarettes. He was like, just like I was watching them, they were watching me. And even before he got sucked into that room, he's the reflection having all of those cigarette, dots in the distance, all popping up over the window. I thought that was beautifully framed and done. But when John went in there, obviously he got sucked into the jungle as well. And history repeated itself, but this time Carlos was stepping on a mine. And I thought in the long run, the message of this episode, maybe it could have been, was not to fight. Sometimes it's you don't have to use brute strength. You don't have to give into your anger. You can find another, he could make up for the past. It's I could save you I couldn't save Murphy. And so it turns out Jimmy, because I thought it was interesting how Jimmy just disappeared around the corner. I was like, how the hell you disappear that fast? And then all of a sudden he gets killed. It's oh, because it was him acting. It's yeah, I'm immortal. We could still bleed, but I won't die from it. So everything he's been doing up until now, he knows the Akrita is coming. And so I'm assuming every other person because I didn't know if it was just kind of a warrior thing of oh, I'm just going to kill you, challenge me. I live for the battle. I live for the war. It still could be. But based on what he said with John, I don't know whether everything with John was just specifically towards John, or was that what he was doing to every vet he was coming across? He was trying to find a champion. He needed a warrior that could face what was coming, Or was it just specifically he saw it in John because it was oh, I know the Akrita are here, but you're a soldier and you're a hunter. The fact is you have it. I've been pushing that anger in you because I see it in you. I see the potential of the warrior you can be for this fight. John got really messed up. I mean, it's pretty easy to get messed up when you're literally going up against an immortal god who can bleed and stuff like that. But he's kind of got all access to his powers, and when you're just a mortal man. And John got pretty beat up, and he did heal John's scars because it's right, pick up the helmet, you are kind of my John hadn't really landed a blow on him, but he was going to give him the help. He's like, yeah, pick it up. I guess that's like, he was going to take you more so under his wing at that point in time to really, really train you. But he did heal all the scars on John, and because he did focus on the scar from Murphy, so it might be gone. They never showed you after the fact, but I'm assuming because all those wounds healed up, because he was like, right, you're letting your scars hold you back. The past hold you back. So that ended up healing. I'm assuming he no longer has that, and he probably wanted that reminder of the mistake he made, like his unwillingness to let go of the past. He wasn't fully ready to let go, and he was kind of forced to let go, and that's not, it's not like John resolved that, But luckily, Maggie and Lotta were able to track down info about Mars and everything. Interestingly enough, they got Millie's help because, well, that's the only way to go see John to get this information to him and Carlos, because only a family member can meet. And then I love, they're like, all right, they're like, do you got this handle? She's like, yeah. Did Yoko Ono like get unfairly blamed for the breakup of the Beatles? And neither one of them had a response. She turns to him, she's like, yes. I was like, yeah, that's interesting. I do. That is kind of one of those interesting, just quick aside, I thought this kind of interesting reference, but I'm like, I feel like that's always just kind of been dished on her of like, she's the reason why, she's always used in that verbiage way of like, oh, you don't want to be was this so-and-so the Yoko Ono of this? Because she's kind of used in that, right? But I'm like, I've never really heard the other side of people being like, no, there are other contributing factors. She gets put on her solely, but it's like, no, there are other things too. I feel like I never hear that conversation. I just kind of, I've always, at least growing up, I've always heard that, it's only on Yoko. Just kind of an interesting thing that they made. Just a little small, like, kind of reference there just because of the times and everything, but still, I thought that was kind of it's an interesting, larger conversation. Either way, because they were able to find the vase and break it, he lost all his god powers, and John was able to kill him. And you see that brutality that exists in John, that anger. Not only did you stab him with the spear, then you proceeded to bludgeon him with the helmet, And I thought John, after stabbing, was like, no, I'm not like you. I was going to walk away. I was like, I'm not going to give in to my anger, but no, he kind of did. So, like, that's what I'm saying. I think it's interesting because I think Carlos made a lot of progress this episode. And I think Maggie, I hate to say Maggie, Mary and Lotta did with the whole Maggie thing, which we'll get to in a bit. But, because when Carlos saw him, Carlos was almost like shaken up with just like seeing how bloodied he was and seeing what he had done. But in the end, Carlos thanked him because he's like, right, you were willing to sacrifice yourself to make sure I got out of here. Because it's like, right. I mean, that is the thing. Like, yes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and that is so damn true in this universe in particular. But it's also like, yeah, John was trying to do the right thing, but there is a bigger thing there. So, because even Carlos didn't fully understand. He's like, yeah, like, Mars just saw something deeper in John. He saw that John had the potential. So I guess the lady in control of the Akrita and stuff like that, because this doesn't seem like, this wasn't a job that they specifically, like, because she seems to be the one that masterminded and made sure they got the very specific jobs they've gotten in the past. So I can only assume, like, that's why she'd show up here, because I don't know if there's anything she could pull from, like, essentially. I mean, you would think there'd be something you could pull from a dead god, but yeah, he died as a god, but he ended up losing so much of his strength, so maybe there's not enough to pull there, or just like, maybe it's very specific supernatural monsters you're gathering the souls or life force of the essences of, either way. So, it is a heartbreaking thing of, like, one of the last shots in the episode is John in the shower/tub just kind of rocking back and forth, and his mom holding him, because Carlos is trying to, he's going to start coming to these groups, and because the doctor was like, yeah, we're going to try and do better, and I think I had the potential, Carlos, to kind of get some real healing done, and so he invites John. He's like, hey, if you ever want to talk about it, and so we see later on he's got the group circle going, and John's seat's empty, so maybe, hopefully, given enough time, he will change his mind. But focusing on the Maggie and Lotta side of things, this episode touches on the Maggie side of things. It turns out, like, no one's touched Maggie's room since she died. They tried to preserve it as well as they could because John accidentally almost walked in there, and both Lotta and Mary are trying to find their way through because even Lotta's like, right, like I wish she was around sometimes so she could help me figure out how to move forward without her being around. Because she meant a lot to both of them, and finding their way forward hasn't been the easiest thing. And this episode, the men of letters are only going to have, because I think that's kind of interesting. And I wonder, did that eventually change? Because that might have just been, I thought that was interesting because basically Lotta's perspective is like, right, these were just some like old white dudes. So like their view on mythology, kind of like anything that kind of predates like Christianity and stuff, like Christian like lore and stuff to pull from, like all that is kind of out of here. So she's like, yeah, it's not the extensive library. So I'm like, oh, is that all that is this? Yeah, this is the same, eventually the same place that Dean and Sam end up in Supernatural, right? Because that's in Lawrence, Kansas, isn't it? Or am I mistaken? Like, because they might end up in a different, I don't remember. Oh God, like my Supernatural lore is leaving me. I'm so sorry. I feel like such an idiot. It's such probably common knowledge of like, you idiot, it's blah, 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 you know? But so that's where I'm like, I don't know if it's the same place or not. I feel like it's not, but maybe it is, and I'm just not remembering correct. Because I do feel like the place in particular, their bunker for the, well, it's also in Kansas, but like I said, maybe that's just me like rewriting history in my brain. Maybe, like I said, maybe it's the same place, maybe it's not. Regardless of it, because I was about to say like they faced off against stuff that probably like went outside of that realm. So I mean, they had their own pool of knowledge to pull from because it wasn't just the men of letters stuff they were relying on. They also had the advantage of, well, they have access to the internet. So like Sam was able to collect data from like any like mythology that was kind of collected like of any background, so they had a wider range. So it's like, yeah, like anything they couldn't find in the men of letters library, the web kind of helped them fill that gap. So it's like, yeah, because that was mainly Sam's main resource. Typically was the internet, so just because they probably didn't have all the scriptures and the texts that were related to, you get the point I'm trying to make. Either way, they eventually do go into Maggie's room, and it's them both taking this first step, and them taking it together meant that it made it easier because it's like, right, they had each other to hold on to during the situation. And so they ended up finding out that Maggie, anytime she went on a hunt, she never mailed these things, but she would write down 2 things that went wrong. Was it 2 things that went wrong and 1 thing that went right, or vice versa? Like, it was kind of her way of compensating and dealing with everything. Like Lotta was asking like how she found her way to kind of view, but like when you're kind of surrounded by that darkness, when that kind of consumes your life as it will as a hunter, how do you see the good in the world when you're surrounded by that much darkness? And that was her way. And we see that Lotta and Mary at the end of the episode are making it that way of compensating. Because I think it's also like, right, this is how we handle things, just like Maggie did. But also by doing the same thing Maggie did, it's almost like they're still connected to her in that regard. So I thought that was nice. But like I said, I think with just the themes and elements that this episode provided, and just like using, both these, Carlos and John, as well as Maggie and Lotta, both kind of dealing with the past. Like I said, I feel like everyone else took steps forward except for John, but I think even John's steps but they probably weren't as big as everyone else's, but I think he did take some steps forward. But we'll also have to wait to see where the next episode takes us to really kind of showcase where this is all going to head going forward, and whether this situation has, like Morris was saying, like, oh, like you've done it, you're ready for the coming war against the Akrita. We'll have to wait and see. But really, that's all I want to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and goodbye.